Okay, I'm starting the live stream. Good morning, everybody. I think we'll get started. Good morning and welcome to Morning Coffee with STrEAM Academy. I'm Adam O'Kelke, the principal of STrEAM, and it's awesome to have everyone on today. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for everyone out there watching on YouTube, either live or later on. It is Tuesday, May 12th, and I'm shocked. I can't believe I'm saying that out loud when I say it's already May 12th. It has really started to fly by after March and April seem to be the longest months in the history of mankind. Welcome. Thanks for joining us. We have a really cool morning coffee lineup for you today and on Thursday. So come back on Thursday and watch again. But today we have, skip down for a second. We have two presentations with guest speakers. The first, we have trauma-informed care and self-care, especially related to the times that we're in, with Andranel Brown and Whitney Diatri. And Andranel and Whitney are STrEAM Academy founders, and they are on our APC board and do a lot of other cool things and have a lot of other awesome expertise they bring to the table. So they are going to be our first presenters and share with us here in a moment. As soon as I get tired of talking, which some of you guys know takes a while. And then the second guest we have on today a little bit later will be Gara, and that's also super exciting. Les is a former state representative at the state level, state of Alaska, pretty well known. It was in the legislature for quite a long time. An avid outdoorsman, advocate for the outdoors, and a fly fisherman and adventurer, and also a really strong advocate for children. If you follow Les during his legislative career, and now he's a big advocate for foster children and for kids for our schools. And speaking of Les, I see him popping on and joining us now. So Les, if you can hear me yet, welcome. Thank you for joining us. And so in the second half of the show today, Gara is going to talk about how to talk to your legislators. And it's an awesome topic, how to talk to your legislators about education. And who better to tell us how to do that and give us tips as educators and parents than a legislator. He knows the inside source. I got to say, it's kind of cool. Les, I'm pretty sure knows of our presenters today. And I told him last night, you're welcome to come on later in the morning coffee, for your presentation in the second half. And he said, no, that's okay. I will come on in the first half, because he really wanted to see Whitney and Andranel's presentation today. So I thought that was pretty cool. So that's what we've got on the slate for today, and it's pretty exciting. I do want to put in a plug really quick for next week. Join us next week. That should say Tuesday and Thursday, not Thursday and Tuesday. That's funny. Next week on Tuesday, the 14th, we have two guests again. We have Miss Gable, a professor with UAA, and she has worked with us as a volunteer on movement and physical activity. She does this cool like movement drumming activity with our kids, and it's a lot of fun. And we have a special guest speaker, Ivy Sponholtz, who's state representative for East Anchorage area. And then on Thursday, we've got a really cool visit to learn more about project-based learning, talk about project-based learning, which is the driving educational philosophy at STrEAM. And that's with Ms. Gatlin, who's here with us today. Wave Ms. Gatlin to everybody so we see. Hi, Ms. Gatlin. There we go. And Dr. Kay Sturm from the UMI project, who is a PBL, project-based learning expert and consultant we work with. And then the second piece of that show, we've invited the principals of 2 charter school programs in ASD that are homeschool correspondence program. We've invited them to join us. They're close colleagues of mine. Charter school principals work really closely together. And really there's not a whole lot of competition with charter schools as much as we share a lot. So we've had homeschool students who have been homeschooled or been homeschooled a long time come to STrEAM. And so really our charter school is kind of one step from homeschool in the eyes of a lot of parents. And so they're going to come on and talk about their programs for parents that are interested. So that's our lineup for today. I skipped over that. We start with thanks to Andranel and Whitney who are with us. They have always started our meetings this way, and I started to start our staff meetings this way. I thought, why not start every meeting this way? So thanks to them, we start our meetings with our mission statement. Anchored STrEAM Academy empowers students to be involved learners, critical thinkers, and engaged citizens who are inspired by the natural world. And so with that, I will turn it over to our first guest speakers or presenters and allow them to start to share. So let me introduce to you Whitney Diatri and Andranel Brown.
Good morning. Thank you so much. Make sure I get the right screen set up here. And now I can see no one. Great. All right. So welcome to our, what we hope will be a relatively brief introduction, or I'm seeing a head shake from Sylvia. Okay, no, all right. About embracing comfort and building resilience, especially during building self-care during crisis. Yes, Sylvia.
We're seeing your speaker notes screen. If you want to go to your main slide, that would be great.
Oh, wow. Thank you. Better?
No, that's still on.
Let's try this. No. So when I open the share thing, all 3 of them look the same. Like, I don't know which one's the one I want. How's that?
It's still the same.
Thank you for your patience during these technical challenges. I thought I had it worked out. How about now?
Yes,
You're
yes.
kidding me.
Yes,
That's it.
now.
Can you see my speaker notes now?
Good morning, people.
No.
Oh, okay, great. I'm Andranel Brown.
I'm Whitney Diatri. And we did want to introduce ourselves a bit. Thanks for being patient with us. That we, come from a middle school background. We are currently both Title I coaches, and in that work of being Title I coaches, we work a lot with trauma informed, or we're trying to become more trauma informed within the school setting and supporting students and teachers and everybody who is supporting others who've experienced trauma. So we've used this time during COVID to try to deepen our knowledge about trauma-informed practices and its effects and manifestations, and how we might support educators even better, because we know it's not just Title I and trauma knows no bounds. So we all sort of share this in common at the moment. But we do want to put out there the disclaimer that neither one of us are counselors or professionals when it comes to supporting, severe trauma. So we will have a list of resources later in this presentation. And if you or anyone you know is having depression or thoughts of self-harm, please seek help other than us. We are not those professionals that can really see that through. So
thank you, Whitney. So our goals for today are twofold. One is to help to talk a little bit about trauma so we can recognize how it shows up. And then also so we can gain strategies to help navigate and build resilience. So a little bit later, we're going to have you do a short activity, depending on time. We'll at least get started on it. So if you have a piece of paper, it can be scrap paper, it doesn't have to be anything fancy, and something to write with, we'll have that available a little bit later.
Okay, again, we have been deepening our knowledge about trauma-informed practices, and so these are the resources and the people that we have been using as our guide specifically for this presentation. And they are Laura Vandernoot-Lipsky, who is a former social worker, probably still social worker, that talks about supporting those who also support trauma on a broad scale. And then Ricky Robertson, who has been doing a lot of work with ASD recently, and he has more of an educator lens on trauma-informed practices and what that looks like for educators and in school settings. So that's kind of our two people. So you might hear us refer to Laura or Ricky Robertson, and this is where it's coming from.
So we'll start by talking about 3 different levels of trauma that Laura Lipsky talks about when in both of her books, The Age of Overwhelm and The Trauma Stewardship. And most of us when we think of trauma, we tend to first think of that personal level of trauma. They tend to be short term, although they might be a little bit longer term, but they can be acute situations like death of a loved one, or they can be more chronic, such as continuing abuse. When it becomes more than just what's happening in our close individual circles, like in our home, it becomes more of a societal. She refers to that as systemic abuse. And that's what we usually tend to think of with what has happened a lot with our Alaska Native and American Native cultures and communities in this country. Talk about that long-term generational abuse and discrimination. And you can see others that are listed there. And then what we are all currently now experiencing, not just in our local lives, like with a natural disaster, like the earthquake last year, but now on a global level, is a community level of experiencing trauma. So with that lens on this, there are 16 ways that trauma tends to show up.
Yeah, so the 16 common responses, if you take a look at that slide, you might recognize some of those and realize that, oh yeah, I have, in these last 2 months, I may have been feeling some or all of those. And they are completely normal, common responses to trauma exposure. And that it is to the minute, to the hour, to the day, to the week. Those can overlap and change, and they are fluid. And so it is not I only feel helplessness or hopelessness. It is, I might in this moment feel helplessness and hopelessness, and then all of a sudden I'm feeling fear or guilt. And so these emotions kind of run the entire gamut and can show up at any time and can recur. So they are recorded, research-based common responses to trauma exposure.
And this comes from Laura
Andranel, anything you wanted to add?
Vandernoot-Lipsky's book, Trauma Stewardship.
Mm-hmm.
This comes from Laura Vandernoot-Lipsky's book, Trauma Stewardship. And it typically, if you search for the 16 trauma, it will be in a circle like this, but we couldn't get an image that had a resolution that was legible. So we've included them in this format. And just to bring back the real point, whatever you are feeling during this time, it is completely normal. So if you feel like you're on a roller coaster ride, welcome to a global traumatic experience. I say with a smile. So it's normal, but it's not sustainable. So what are some things that we can do to help mitigate the stress that we're all feeling?
Yeah, so Ricky Robertson in his work with ASD and beyond, not just ASD, but many school districts, talks about this difference between kind of comfort things that people will do to help relieve some of that stress that comes with trauma. And then there's, so there's sort of the comfort approach and there's a building resilience approach. And the comfort approach has that short-term relief. It can make you feel better in the moment, but it doesn't actually change the situation or your ability to deal with it. So then on the other side of that is the things that you can do for building resilience. So what are those things that I might be able to do that will actually change the brain function and the physiological function to help me be able to process through and get stronger or grow in my ability to deal and handle trauma and stress. And so there's, when you're thinking about self-care and the things that you might strive to create, you want to try to find those things that might offer comfort and are also a way for you to build resilience. And those things are going to be different for everybody. Not everybody's, there's not one list that's going to work for every person. So this is a very, curated list that you would create. And his main point is that when you are creating this list for yourself, be kind to yourself and make a list that you could do even on your toughest day. So even on the day where you are feeling as low as you could be, what kinds of activities or things could you still be able to accomplish that would help both in comfort and in building your resilience with what you're going through? Andranel, anything you want to add?
So when, yes. So when building that self-care plan, make it two parts. Part of it from the comfort side, those things that you can do on the toughest, because we do need to lower our stress levels, do some things to help get those stress hormones down, find some ways to comfort yourself, but keeping in mind a couple of things to keep in balance. One, watch those things that we tend to have addictions for. Alcohol and sugar tend to be pretty strong for people right now. That's pretty common across all of us. But also it warns against being too aspirational in building this self-care plan. So making sure that you have things that you can do on your toughest day to make sure that you can have something that is that quick grab go-to that's going to fill your bucket and actually change the biochemistry of your brain. And the things in the middle are things that research has recognized. They tend to provide comfort. They tend to change us pretty quickly in the short term, and then also purge the stress chemicals, change our biochemistry so that we can access the critical thinking parts of our brain so that we can navigate the trickier parts of what we're experiencing. So this is where you're going to grab that piece of paper. And you're just going to draft out either a grid or a pie or whatever shape you want. Actually, there's nothing magical about the shape. And it'll give you just a little bit of time to do that, about 20 seconds. I see Sylvia giving me a thumbs up. So included on this is a suggestion that Ricky Robertson put out there. He also had a couple of other categories that he spoke about in the webinar that don't appear on either of these. And one of those might be, you might include the category of your professional life. So looking back at and we'll post this slide deck somewhere so you can go back and look at the actual list, but building stuff from this list or from the next list, which is coming, which is the tiny survival guide that the Trauma Stewardship has put out with some ideas about how to actually engage so that you can purge those biochemicals. And I'm going to hand that back over to Whitney.
Yeah, so in the Tiny Survival Guide that comes from Laura Vandernoot-Lipsky and the Trauma Stewardship Institute, the thing that we really, that's another list of things that might help build resilience. And some of these are very aligned with STrEAM, and we're going to talk about those in a second. But the kind of the unique spin that Laura puts on this is that idea of metabolizing the experience or stress. That if you think about stress as something that you're consuming and that your body really needs to metabolize it and process it, that these are things that are going to help you do that. Again, speaking to that physiological brain biochemistry shift that can happen when you do some of these options. And so really being careful that what you're choosing to do is really also like giving you comfort, but also helping you build that resilience to stress and that comes from the trauma. And so the things that we thought were so, perfect to fit inside STREAM and a lot of the families that would tend to come to a school like STREAM are those ideas of going outside and being active, and that, connecting through relationships. So the parts that Laura actually said very specifically is that nature, that connection to nature, and that even if it is a minute of standing outside or even looking at a picture of nature, that can have the same impact on your brain as actually going on a hike. So it doesn't take a lot to get that bit of nature that will help reset your brain and your attitude or your mood, or will at least help improve it. So that, that connection to nature is very, very powerful. And then the part of being active and moving your body and getting oxygen to your system has sort of that same effect, that it starts those physiological changes that help your body metabolize the stress that you're feeling. And that it's, those are very aligned with what STREAM does anyway, but also extremely powerful in all realms. So they're good things to do. And that it doesn't have to be, as Ricky Robertson would say, doesn't mean that you're riding down there, run a marathon every day. It can just be walk to the end of the block and back. And that would accomplish both the active and the outside part of this. So maintaining those ideas on things that you could do even on your toughest day.
Thank you, Whitney. And then there are two other strategies. The first one that is from Laura Lipsky's work, which is to create a gratitude journal. And she recommends setting a timer, something like every 2 hours, or if you're feeling particularly overwhelmed, you could do it in a shorter interval. There's an app that some classroom teachers use that has a variable interval. And whenever that goes off, you just stop whatever you're doing and take a moment to ground yourself where you are and look around for something that you're grateful for. So I myself am super grateful in the midst of this. I just recently rearranged my house and I was like, oh, I live by myself and I get to do whatever I want. And I was really grateful for that. Something that could have been something easily overlooked and unnoticed. There is also research that shows writing stuff down, longhand, pen and paper, has an effect on our brain that is very different and very much more positive than if we just typed it or just noticed it. But if you can't write it down, at the very least, just to stop, take a deep breath, take 30 seconds to notice something that you were grateful for. And then Ricky Robertson shared that there is a strategy that they did research with some nurses, and it's called 3 Good Things, and slight twist on the gratitude journal, but it's 3 good things and your role in them, that being the added layer. And the research had participants do this for 15 consecutive days. And they showed that after those 15 days, that stress and depression levels were greatly reduced, and that they were greatly reduced for months after they quit the activity. And they did this in nurses who were dealing in high trauma. They also said there was an added benefit if you participated in this activity within 2 hours of going to bed, which makes sense. It's priming the pump for being positive before you go into that other very critical role or activity of purging your body and resetting it. So, and that leads us to being at home with kids.
Yes. So for all you parents, right, these all are great ideas. They sound great. You might be able to start implementing them. But it's also a lot to think about, and it might be brand new, and it's a lot to remember. We are planning to, these are already provided to Adam. So this slide deck and these resources will be available to you for you to look later. So you don't have to worry about, keeping it all in your brain for now. But when all else fails and you can't remember anything and you're in that moment, maybe your amygdala is firing, the things that you need to remember are just start with caring. So start with that point of, that care for who you're talking to, care for yourself, and just remembering that emotional piece. And then secondly, connect. So connect with a child, connect with a loved one, connect with yourself, maybe through some of those resilience options. But those are the greatest things that can help anyone through trauma, is that sense of caring and having care for something, and then connecting to others and to yourself. So if all else fails, care and connect first, because what that really does is that changes that brain chemistry to be able to calm your body, relax. And then once that relaxation happens, your prefrontal cortex becomes alive again and you're out of that stress zone. And then you can start to think and reason and find logic and maybe get that little bit of sense of normalcy back. And that's where, you have to have that part of your brain working in order to learn anything, or in order to kind of process complexity. So the idea of, academics and learning and instruction really only can happen after you've mitigated the cortisol and the stress that's happening from trauma. So care, connect, and then move into academics and instruction, if it works for you. There's also, none of that pressure, but if it's some days, it might just not work in these times. Speaking from a parent of 2 children right now.
Great, thank you. And then we have included the list of resources. We've opted to take to stay on the positive side of what we can do and be proactive. We know the reality is that many people are struggling, that this is a time when depression and suicide and abuse tend to ramp up, especially in our communities that are feeling the stress and the financial side of things. So there are tons of, this is a list of resources at the national level. At Teach for Trust is Ricky Robertson's handle on Twitter. If you want to follow him, he also has a Google Drive with this information. And then again, then we have the sources that we use for this. The first one being a webinar. Laura Lipsky's webinar, I will warn you, it does have some adult language in it, nothing major. Although she does drop a couple of words in there, so I wouldn't use it necessarily in your classroom, but the other 2 are definitely very user-friendly. And again, we will put this on the website so that you can go back, build your self-care plan, and have access to any of these resources. And that's it for us. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you.
Awesome, thank you. Here you can use the clapping hands emoji. Awesome, excellent presentation from APC members and founders, Whitney, Diatri, and Andranel Brown. That was really cool. I put a quote in the chat box that I liked towards the end that Whitney said. Let's see if I can go back and find it now. If all else fails, care and connect first. I think that's a great message. When things get stressful, one of the things analogies I use that you've probably all heard with our staff is when you're on an airplane and they're going over the safety procedures, they tell you to put your oxygen mask on first before helping others. And they say, if you have small children, you still need to put your oxygen mask on first. And that's a good reminder for all of us. It's a good reminder for educators that we have to put our oxygen mask on first. We can't help others if we need help ourselves. We can't care for others if we're not taking care of ourselves. That was really great. Thank you both. Before we move on to the next part of morning coffee, is there anyone anyone have anything for Miss Brown or Mrs. Diatri?
I
Go
just
ahead.
want to
I would like to
acknowledge
just
one of
first
our
say
other
thank you
founders
guys.
who
That
Let's try that again. Our counselor, Amy Bones, go ahead.
First, I just wanted to say thank you guys, and I really appreciated the gratitude plug. This week on my website, we're going to talk about gratitude and the power of gratitude, and we talk a little bit about writing things down that you're grateful for, and I also have something on there called the gratitude experiment. So I was really happy to hear that and to just reiterate how powerful just being thankful for the little things is. So thank you very much.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Amy. I like the visual, the graphic, Mrs. Brown, laying out physical, mental, social, and fun and choice things to do, and kind of having that. I'm big on writing stuff down in graphics, and it kind of reminded me of the Covey's 4 quadrants. If you've ever used the Covey 4 quadrants, that's something we've done as a staff a couple times. If you're interested, just Google Covey 4 quadrants, and it helps you to kind of prioritize things in a neat way. Ms. Brown, did you have a comment? You did the one.
I just, when I went out of screen share, noticed that one of the other 6 founders is in the room right now, and I'm so excited. She moved to the East Coast a while ago, have not laid eyes on her. Liz Repetto, so excited to see you here. Glad that you could make it. Miss you. How exciting is this?
You got a STrEAM Academy fan on the East Coast, you guys. I know it's far away, but Adam, you're a great captain of the ship. This made my day. Thank you. And anybody on here, perspective, just apply your kid now. Register now. Bye.
Thank you. Thanks for joining us. That's really cool. All right. I'm going to move us ahead to the next part of morning coffee. The next exciting guest speaker we have with us today for the second half of the show, former state representative and longtime STrEAM supporter. He's been to our school a number of times, worked with several different classes, worked with Miss Gable's social studies classes. We're all a big fan and appreciate the support. And we're really excited to have on former Representative Les Gara. Good morning, Les. Thank you for being here.
Morning. Thanks, Adam. And just so I know, what kind of mix do we have between staff and parents on this morning?
Let's see. Let me go off 50-50 maybe, or 60-40 parents.
Sounds good. So what I wanted to talk to you about, and I don't have a PowerPoint because I haven't quite figured out how to do Zoom and a PowerPoint at the same time. But B, now that I'm not a legislator, when I was a legislator, I could grab numbers from our nonpartisan legislative finance department and produce charts and then have the nonpartisan site as the source there. It's harder for me to do now that, that I'm not in the legislature. But I wanted to talk to you a little bit about both campaign season and legislative season on how to protect schools. And I'll take some questions at the end. I do come with biases. I think schools are underfunded. And I'll try and sort of avoid some of the biases that I have to make this as objective as possible. My last year in the legislature, and while I was in the legislature, I always pushed to keep school funding at least up with inflation. And that hasn't happened. My last year in the legislature, we were able to get an additional $30 million for schools, which was roughly the amount needed to keep funding up with inflation that year. The governor has now vetoed that amount, so we're now $30 million below where we were at the end of 2018. The real point for you as parents and teachers is that we know that teaching to a student works way better than teaching to a crowd, right? Education isn't crowd control, but the bigger our class sizes get, the more education becomes about crowd control, and the less it becomes about finding the students in your class who need the extra help, who may be one of the students that the last presentation addressed, somebody who's suffering trauma from maybe child neglect or abuse at home, or who isn't getting the support at home. And we know as educators and as parents that those are the children who fall through the cracks when you don't have time to work with them. We are roughly 1,000 teachers and staff, English is second only staff, 1,000 teachers and staff below where we were in 2015. We have 1,000 fewer staff teaching and working with our students in our schools than we did in 2015. And as of my last year in the legislature, 2018, measured against inflation, school funding was about $90 million below where it was in 2015. Right now, it's over $100 million below where it was in 2015, with the latest veto from the governor of the $30 million from the school funding budget that the legislature passed. So I don't really want you to remember numbers. We can talk about numbers in the question and answer part. What I do want you to be able to do, if you think class sizes are getting too big, if you think teachers aren't getting the support they need from the legislature, I want you to sort of, I want to give some tips on how to talk to your candidates this summer, because who gets elected really determines what the school funding budget's going to be like next year, right? You know, I always use the example, whether or not you're pro-choice or pro-life, if you elect a pro-life Congress, you're going to get pro-life legislation, and then going down to Washington, D.C. isn't going to make them pro-choice, and vice versa, right? It's who you elect sets the stage. And so you're all going to have candidates who send you literature for this November's election. And then you're going to hear from those candidates as they become legislators next session. I would very strongly urge you during the candidate phase to ask the candidates in your districts what they're going to do about education. If they use code words like schools aren't efficient enough and I'm going to make them more efficient, that's a fake answer, because the legislature really has no role on how funds get spent within a district. And if you ask me, the proof that we've underfunded our schools is shown by the 1,000 staff we've lost since 2015. I mean, if you think that makes schools better, I guess you can make an argument. I've heard that from legislators, that schools can do better if they're leaner and meaner. Well, meaner isn't a way to teach, and leaner just makes class sizes larger. And that's what we've seen in Anchorage and Juneau and Fairbanks, class sizes that are bigger now than they were in 2015. And that are going to be bigger next year than they were this year because of the latest veto that came down. So there used to be a lot of code words that legislators used to make it sound like they supported education funding. They used to say, I support full funding of education. All that meant, actually, technically in legal terms, full funding meant you were going to fund schools at the same level you funded them the prior year. So it sounded good, but it meant that they were going to support a budget that fell behind inflation, which meant you would have to lay off more teachers and more staff. Every legislator and every candidate who's going to come to your door or send you literature will say they're pro-education because education polls well. I kidded Ethan Berkowitz once many years ago before I was in the legislature. He sent out a flyer and it said pro-education, anti-crime. and I had some other thing, and it's like, who is not pro-education, anti-crime? And he said, yeah, I know, it was just too hard to put too many words on the flyer, which I got. But every legislator will say that. So what do you say to the candidates who come by your door, or who you can call when they're running this summer, and then the legislators after they become legislators? And really, the issue is, if their answer is, I'm going to make schools more efficient, that sounds good. It's been a line I heard during my 16 years in the legislature. They really can't do that. Anchorage right now spends a very high percentage of its school funding on teachers and staff, about 80%, and 20% on administration, which is among the highest ratios in the state. Really, the point is, are you going to increase school funding to meet the rise in the cost of inflation? If they tell you, I'm going to find efficiencies, that schools are wasting money, well, every big institution wastes money, okay? It's just the nature of big institutions. No matter how well-intentioned that institution is, no administrator of an institution can hover over every single employee in that entity to know they're doing the perfect job. Though I think the Anchorage School District does a very good job. So if they tell you they're going to find efficiencies, ask them what they are. But if they're not going to increase funding to go along with inflation, I would say that's a good indication that you're going to fall further behind with that legislator or that candidate than one who says, I'm going to keep funding up with inflation, or even make up for prior losses. It's really what the legislature does on education largely is about funding that then goes to the school districts and then gets distributed to schools. And that funding compared to inflation is about $120 million now below where it was in 2015. And that's why you see the layoffs, and that's why you see the bigger class sizes. Those things go hand in hand. So, I mean, ask your candidates, and then afterwards, ask your legislators, what do you think about public education? They'll say they support it, public education. What are you going to do to protect public education? And if they don't agree that funding has fallen too far behind and they have to increase funding, they're probably going to do what we've seen over the last 5-6 years, which is they're going to be part of that group that passes budget that lays off more and more teachers, more and more staff, and increases class sizes more and more. And I've seen a couple posts about how big some class sizes have gotten. So yeah, it's really the code words. Yeah, everybody's going to support education. Are you going to increase funding? And if they are enthusiastic about that, keeping funding at least up with inflation. Wait for them to say it. If they're enthusiastic about it, then that's probably somebody you can trust on public education. If they say schools spend too much money and blah, 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 listen to where they think schools are spending too much money. I bet you can always find a place. But if they're not going to increase funding, really that's the chicken's way out of saying they're not going to keep funding up with inflation. And so really it's about funding, and really interview your candidates very strongly about that. When people run for the legislature, they will answer questions. You'll have a phone number you can call from their literature, and if you don't see them at your door. And really who you elect matters. And then after the election, you, of course, I'd encourage you to stay active. 2 members who are now running for or who are in office founded a great group called Great Alaska Schools. And I used to work with them very closely. And they sort of help people sort of get through the fluff. Which legislators really were doing things to reduce class sizes and which legislators or candidates were not. They're not as active as they were before. Elise Galvin was one of the founders. She's running for Congress. Dina Mitchell is now on the school board. So you have an advocate there on the school board. Great Alaska Schools Anchorage, their Facebook page is still active. So I would encourage folks to follow Great Alaska Schools Anchorage. Great Alaska Schools statewide, that group seems to have become a little dormant over the last year, but Great Alaska Schools Anchorage still remains active. So that's a good source of information. And the folks there have been pretty good about sort of sifting through what's true and what's not true. You know, I don't need to tell the teachers on here how much more difficult it is to teach a larger classroom than a smaller classroom. You know, the national studies are that our classrooms in middle school should be about 18 students per class. Lower grades, kindergarten through fourth, about 15, 16 students per class. We don't have that anymore in most of our schools in Alaska. You know, now we're teaching to 30 kids, and a lot of youth fall through the cracks as a result. And I don't think that's the way we want to go. With that, I should probably take some questions, but I think the key is really funding. It's as much as we don't want to hear it, it's funding. And then that will, of course, lead to a much bigger discussion about what the state's going to do now that it's spent its $17 billion worth of savings. And we remain one of the few states in the country, the only state in the country without a sales or an income tax. We don't have a fiscal plan. So in order to balance the budget next year, just this year's budget, which is a budget that includes over $100 million of cuts to the university over the last few years, school funding that's fallen over $100 million behind inflation. Just this lean budget that we have this year, to fund that, you're going to have no dividend. That's where we are in terms of revenue. When you don't have revenue, you don't get to say, well, I'll fund schools and the permanent fund dividend and seniors and public safety. Things start dropping by the wayside. It's an inconvenient truth that you need revenue coming into the state to run a state. And we haven't had it. I was part of a bipartisan House majority in 2017 that passed a fiscal plan. We wouldn't have an unbalanced budget right now. We'd have enough money for schools, but that was blocked in the Senate, unfortunately. So, I suppose, you know, this becomes much more controversial, but if folks don't talk about new revenue coming into the state, substantial new revenue, we're out of savings basically by next year. And then the only source is the permanent fund. And then you face the choice of, is it a dividend, or is it education, or is it seniors, or is it public safety? Because there's not enough to do all at this point. I think that's what I'd have to say. And I'll take questions if folks have them.
Awesome. Thank you, Representative Gara. We really appreciate that insight, and unfortunately a stark picture, but one that it's good for all of us to be aware of. I know that as someone who grew up in Alaska, I thought of the legislature as a far away, almost inaccessible body at times. When I became president of the State Principals Association, and part of my job was to fly to Juneau and advocate for public education, I was really surprised by not only how accessible legislators were, but how big of an impact a single story would make. And I would have conversations with legislators who had one story from a constituent about schools, either positive or negative, and they were really locked in. That was the perspective they were bringing back to the table, that single story that impacted them, that was powerful. And so I that always stuck with me, that I don't think we always understand the access we have to our legislature and to our legislators, and the power of calling them and telling them your story, and just telling them, you know, your experience about public education has. So I was wondering if you could give us some insight on that, like from a legislator's perspective. What does it mean to a legislator when a constituent gets you on the phone and says, you know, Representative Gara, I need to tell you about my school, or about something that happened?
With your better legislators, they'll listen and hopefully learn from it. There are some legislators who go down there with an agenda, and you're never going to shake that agenda, right? They'll just use the stories that fit their agenda. And that's sad. But there are those who learn and those who listen. If you follow the Great Alaska Schools Anchorage Facebook page, they'll let you know when the public hearings are on education and on the budget. And I think testimony from parents and from teachers and from staff helps a lot. I know when I had my education funding bill in 2018, it was very important for me to hear from teachers who were telling me how bigger their class sizes were getting, so the other legislators understood. Because if you don't want to increase school funding, you will walk around with this fiction in your head that everything is okay. And legislators need to hear that everything's not okay. I'll tell you, when I was in a bipartisan House majority of, it was a very slim majority in 2018. I didn't even have my Democrats and Republicans on board for an education funding increase because they felt we just didn't have enough money. And we don't have enough money to do everything that we need, but I needed to get across to them that flat funding education at the same level as last year was going to result in even bigger class sizes and even bigger cuts. And teachers and parents and principals all came forward and got legislators to understand that and open minds. And that's why that bill did pass the House. It got blocked in the Senate, but the end of the year deal between the Senate was that we added another $30 million to education funding. And it was because people came forward and explained things to legislators for them to understand that flat funding, the same amount as last year, was really a cut. So that's how we passed that $30 million increase. My job was to educate legislators, and to do that, I needed parents and teachers and principals to testify, and they did. So it does matter.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's such an important point that can get lost so easily, that if funding stays flat, it's really a funding cut. If they fund us at the same amount next year that they did this year, it's actually a cut, because costs rise in any business. Costs keep going up, salaries naturally increase. I mean, there's the cost of healthcare has risen astronomically over the last 10 years, and just there's always increasing costs. So flat funding is really a funding cut. I think that's an very important point to take away. Do we have anybody? You can either hold up a 1 or a 2 if there's more than one person, or 3. If anybody who would like to ask a question or have a comment for Representative Gara. Or you can use the little blue raised hand. And Miss Goodman, go ahead.
Thanks so much for being on, Les. I
Sure.
was wondering if you had any idea of how much population has changed since 2015, when you're talking about the changes in the numbers, that actually could mean more depending on where the student population has changed.
So it's a good question. Were I in the legislature, I'd be able to show you that on a per student basis, education funding has fallen. Student populations are roughly stable. They were going down for a little bit. So what you would hear from some legislators is, yeah, it's the same amount of money, but population has gone down. And that's a way that folks will get shined on. Population has been relatively flat over the last few years. On a per student basis, so that takes into account student populations, still education funding has fallen down behind inflation. And so I would say, if somebody tells you, we don't need to put any more money into education because funding is going down, or our populations are going down, that's their code for they're not gonna do anything to keep class sizes stable or reduce class sizes. And really the funding formula already is on a per student basis. If that remains flat, that's a cut. I think it's gone down just a little bit over the last 5 years.
That's a great point. Thank you. That our funding is at the BSA, the base student allocation, is where school funding starts. And so STrEAM Academy is funded directly based on the number of students we have enrolled. So that's a very good point. Any other questions for our awesome guest speaker today? Good morning, Connor. Melissa Reed, one of our parents. Go ahead.
Hi, I was just curious. So you mentioned diversifying our sources of income, which obviously is really key. Are there any sources of income that Alaska could be moving toward that would directly benefit education without impacting those other needs for that revenue to be allocated?
That's a good question. So the Alaska Constitution basically doesn't say, look, we can adopt this tax and that money from that tax will go just to schools. There's something called the dedicated funds prohibition in the Constitution. And that was because the founders in the 1950s put that provision in there because there are certain popular things. And if you fund only the popular things, there's no money for substance abuse treatment. There's no money for domestic violence prevention, right? Because everybody would dedicate every single penny to public safety, education. And so they said, our tax revenue, our oil tax revenue, any income tax revenue, if we ever have it, tax revenue really cannot be dedicated to a particular purpose. The money just goes into a pool and the legislature every year decides how to allocate it. So even if somebody says we're going to adopt a school tax, that money isn't required to go to education. We are really at the point where we're about $1 billion below what we need to fund a basic budget, a little bit more than $1 billion below what we need if we want to get the university and schools back to where they were a few years ago. And the only way to get there is through difficult decisions. Since 2014, people have said, let's cut the budget. We've cut the budget by over $600 million in terms of education and agency spending, by over $3 billion total since 2015. And that still hasn't solved the budget gap because we have no revenue coming in. In my view, we have a weak oil tax. We have maybe the weakest oil tax in the United States. So I'm personally working on the oil tax initiative. That's the only revenue that's on the horizon that can be adopted, that would go into effect by January. If you want an income or a sales tax, we still have seen no proposals from this legislature or last year's legislature on an income or a sales tax. And once you get that proposal passed, it takes 2 years to implement. So even if this legislature next year were to adopt an income tax, it's not going to take place till 2022. We're out of savings at that point. That's why people are now dipping into the available part of the permanent fund. It's not the best place to go, but it's the only place that's available at this point. We had $17 billion of savings. That will be down to less than $1 billion by the end of this budget year, and will be gone by next year. So you really need to do some mix of corporate taxes, some sort of individual tax that's fair. We're in a COVID world now, so you've got to make sure you're not taxing low-income people, at least at least until we're through this crisis. But you can tax higher income people who haven't really suffered as much through the health crisis. And I personally think we're not getting a fair share for our oil. Though at current oil prices, it's not going to make a big difference to change it. But what everybody knows is oil prices jump around, and wherever they are, people think that's the oil price for the future. And so when they were $130 a barrel, we thought that was the new price. When they were $80 a barrel, we thought that was the new price. Today, they're $25 a barrel. We think that's the new price. They're going to bounce around. That's just what the oil market does. But I think it's sort of got to be a three-legged stool, some version of a personal tax to keep the personal taxes down, some more fair level of oil taxes that's much closer to what states charge in the lower 48. Alaska ConocoPhillips is the only company that publishes their Alaska profits. They're required to by the Securities Exchange Commission. No other company shares their Alaska profits.
Today.
But Alaska is their most profitable region in North America.
Awesome, thank you. I think we'll take one more question. One of our parents and APC board members, Heather Swanson, has a question. Then we'll have to start to wrap up and let people go. Heather?
I didn't have a question. I was just going to say hi to Les. Les, and I've known Les forever. When I lived in Juneau, Connor's very first experience with the legislature was sitting on Les's lap in the finance committee while I testified. When he was like 6 months. So we've known each other for a long time. And I just wanted to say thank you so much for coming by and saying hi.
Sure, no problem. Thanks.
Thank you. I think that's a great note to wrap up on. Thank you so much to Andranel Brown and Whitney Diatri for your presentation on trauma and self-care. Thank you to everyone who joined us today. Thank you so much, former Representative Gara, for coming on and sharing your knowledge and your insights. We will be reaching out and advocating for our kids and for education. Keep us informed on ways we can be involved and help. We really appreciate your time. So thank you so much to our guests today. I want to remind you, I had my dates all messed up on my slides at the beginning. So if anyone just watched the beginning, I thoroughly confused everyone. I want to remind folks on Thursday, we'll be back for morning coffee and you're welcome to join us. We will have Professor Gable on with us. And the next week, I think the dates are just getting away from me because I still can't believe it's as late in May as it is already. Next week, on Tuesday, we have our morning coffee. Miss Gatlin, who's our project coordinator at STrEAM, and Dr. STrEaM are going to be talking about project-based learning for parents who might be new to that or just might want more information. And we also have a couple other guest speakers on, and then we won't have coffee on Thursday. It's the last day of school. We have a school-wide Zoom assembly to say goodbye to our 8th graders and celebrate the year. But we do have a special morning coffee on Friday next week, Friday, May 22nd. And we have an author, someone who was slated to be a TED speaker, but COVID disrupted the TED conference she was going to speak at. If you look her up, Allison Holzer, she's got a book on inspiration and talks a lot about inspiration, and that'll be kind of her topic, coming on a nationally recognized, guest speaker for that. So with that, we want to say thank you for joining us for coffee at STrEAM Academy. Thank you so much to our guests. Join us Thursday. Join us next week, and we'll stop the live stream and we'll say goodbye and have a great day, everyone.